What if I told you that anxiety is fundamentally a good thing? Now, some of you might be wondering, what the heck am I talking about? And I can explain. So I want to take the next little bit to talk about what anxiety is, how it's different from an anxiety disorder, and also have a quick chat with you about what the chronically anxious brain looks like. But don't worry, I promise not to bore you with any scientific jargon here. My goal is to just provide you with some basic, foundational knowledge on what anxiety is, since it's inevitably relevant to all of us, and it's important to know what something is before we can figure out how to deal with it. Now, don't get me wrong, experiencing anxiety sucks. I personally don't know anyone who enjoys that pit in their stomach feeling, or those sweaty, clammy hands, or that flushed face look. Yeah, honestly, none of that is sexy. We all know this. However, it is sometimes essential. Simply put, anxiety is a natural physiological response that's been passed down to us from our early ancestors to help protect us from danger. Now, you might know this physiological response as fight or flight, but there are actually 5 different physiological responses that humans rely on when faced with danger. Aside from fight and flight, there's also the freeze, flop, and fawn response. And to help you remember all of them, you can think of them as the 5 Fs. Now, when our brains process that we're in danger, any one of the 5 Fs kicks in depending on the situation. Now, fight and flight are pretty self-explanatory. When you're in a dangerous situation, your brain quickly assesses whether you have better odds of fighting the threat or booking it. But fight and flight may not always work, which is where any of the other 3 Fs come in. Now, freeze and flop share similarities in that they both involve not having the ability to move much or think clearly. But in the freeze response, our bodies tense up, while in the flop response, our bodies loosen up and kind of turn into jello. Think of the Tube Man, but just a very scared version of him. Now, you might wonder, how the heck can these 2 responses benefit you? But in certain cases, they could actually save your life. For example, you don't want to piss off a ferocious, wild animal that is approaching you by fighting it or running away from it. You won't have very good odds there. So you might then freeze or flop instead. And both responses can help to protect you from feeling the extent of the pain and fear that you're in by signaling your brain to release endorphins that act as analgesics, or painkillers in other words. Now, the fawn response, on the other hand, involves engaging in people-pleasing behaviors for the purpose of self-preservation. Let me give you another extreme example here, okay? Think of someone who is being repeatedly physically and emotionally abused, and who is unable to utilize their fight, flight, flop, or freeze response to escape the abuse. Now, the fawn response may kick in that case to prompt the person being abused to please and obey their abuser so that they may try and reduce the abuse and protect themselves. Now, in an extreme case like this, it's totally normal and necessary to rely on our anxiety protective mechanism. But the line between regular anxiety and an anxiety disorder is quite a fine line, which is why hundreds of millions of people around the world suffer from an anxiety disorder at some point in their lives. Now, it's important to note that there are several different types of anxiety disorders, and some are more prevalent than others. But at the end of the day, all anxiety disorders share a common theme, and that's the idea that when our natural anxiety response runs on overdrive, it turns our anxiety into an unproductive chronic condition. And when your anxious brain is running on overdrive, you don't need to be chased by a bear in the woods in order to feel intense anxiety. A simple social interaction or an upcoming test will do just the trick. Your anxious brain signals to your body that the social interaction or that upcoming test you're about to take part in is going to cause you some kind of harm. And so your heart might start to pound, or you might start to tremble, or you might pay one too many uncomfortable visits to the toilet, all in anticipation of this perceived danger. Now, psychologically, you might be overthinking what you're going to say in that conversation, and you will likely lose focus on the test. And indeed, you might end up having a negative experience in either situation. Now, this negative outcome would then create a feedback loop inside your mind that confirms and reinforces your initial fears, which will then lead to further anxiety in similar future situations. So with all of that being said, what is it that leads our natural protective mechanisms to run on overdrive? In other words, what leads people to develop anxiety disorders? Well, there are many different reasons why people develop anxiety disorders. A few common reasons include having another mental health condition already, such as depression or obsessive-compulsive disorder, for example. Sometimes it's growing up in unsafe or unstable environments. Sometimes it's struggling with substance abuse. and sometimes it's experiencing trauma or abuse at some point in life, such as that example I provided earlier with the person being repeatedly abused and having to rely on their fawn response. Now let's roll with that example for a minute here. Let's say that that person has successfully managed to escape the abuse and they're now practically living a better and safer life. Well, they might very well continue to live in survival mode on a mental level, and this is due to prior conditioning from the abuse that they experienced. So, even though they're no longer being abused in the present, they might very well continue to display extreme people-pleasing behaviors at the expense of their own well-being, which would then likely lead them to be at a higher risk of getting themselves in unhealthy relationships that might reinforce their chronic anxiety even further. Nonetheless, it's still certainly possible to develop an anxiety disorder even without going through such adversities in life. Sometimes an anxiety disorder can develop from too much stress, or too much procrastination, or too many perceived pressures and expectations. The idea is that negative experiences can, over time, negatively impact our brains if we don't have the appropriate coping strategies. Now, I want you to imagine for a minute here that your brain is like a town, and inside this town are various streets that connect to each other. And just imagine that you have the ability to constantly build new streets and intersections in this town. Now, these streets represent the neural pathways inside your brain, and the ability to build new streets represents your brain's ongoing ability to build new neural pathways and connections. In other words, this means that your brain has the ability to wire and rewire itself. Now, our behaviors and reactions to experiences that we go through in life build and reinforce new neural pathways and connections all the time. So anytime we have an experience that provokes our anxiety response somehow without appropriate coping strategies, it's as if we're gradually wiring our brains into a chronically anxious state. So the more that we think and behave anxiously, the more we reinforce a chronic sense of anxiety inside our brains. Now, this is the point where anxiety starts turning into an anxiety disorder, and our brain's ability to learn, concentrate, remember, process thoughts, make decisions, and regulate emotions, all of that becomes compromised. So now imagine this town of yours is filled with poorly maintained streets that have cracks and dead ends and roadblocks and poor lighting. That makes for a pretty crappy town, and yet hundreds of millions of us live in towns like this all the time inside our own minds. But the good news is, just as your brain has the ability to wire itself into a chronically anxious state, it also has the ability to rewire itself towards a healthier state. And if you want to learn more about proven and effective ways to manage that pesky anxiety of yours, be sure to watch part 2 of this video by clicking the link in the description below. And if you like the content in this video and want to see more like it, then I invite you to subscribe to my channel. Thank you all so much for watching this video, and I will see you in part 2.